rocking. Perfect. So thanks everybody for joining us for our July Lunch and Learn, co-hosted by GiGi's Playhouse Nashville and DSAMT. We're excited about Todd Staley joining us today to give us a recap of the 2021 legislative session and all of the ways that that session has impacted issues facing and related to our loved ones with disabilities, specifically Down syndrome. Real quick announcements and housekeeping. Everybody's muted right now, which is great. For the duration of the presentation, if you can keep yourself muted, that really helps with background noises. But there is a chat feature here in GoToMeeting. So if you see the little speech bubble up in, should be the top right-hand corner of your screen, feel free to type in anything in the chat, any questions you have as we go. And we'll be sure to save time for a Q&A there at the end. And so just some quick upcoming events to be aware of. Both GiGi's and DSAMT have upcoming golf tournaments to help raise funds for our organizations. So if you're a golfer or want to volunteer, those are both great ways to get involved. DSAMT's golf tournament is on August 2nd, and you can find out more information on their website, which is somethingextra.org. And GiGi's golf tournament is on August 30th, and you can learn more and register at gigisplayhouse.org/Nashville. So anyway, it's a joy for me today to welcome and introduce Todd Staley, who is the Vice President on the Board of Directors at DSAMT, and a legislative whiz. And so I'm going to let Todd introduce himself and get rolling. So thanks for joining us, Todd.
Awesome. Thanks, Carter. First, thank you all for joining me this afternoon, and I appreciate DSAMT and GiGi's coming together to put on these lunch and learns, particularly being able to do this in a virtual environment and get some good participation. So, you know, Carter kind of already touched on, but I currently serve on the board of DSAMT and serve as vice president. I'm an attorney and work for the Department of Financial Institutions. I've been with the state for about 18 years. 13 of those years was with the state legislature, and the last 5 has been with the department, where I serve as the department and administrative representative before the legislature. I also teach legal and public policy courses at Trevecca, and most importantly, I'm a dad to Charlotte and Harrison, and Charlotte is my daughter with something extra, who is 11. And she's pictured here with me and Governor Lee a couple of years ago at a Down Syndrome Day on the Hill. So what do we want to try to accomplish today? Well, first, you're going to get this kind of crash course civics lesson for those of you not familiar with the legislative process in Tennessee. And next, we're going to look at kind of what happened during this most recent legislative session. And then finally, we're going to discuss some of the ways that you can advocate for issues that are important to the Down syndrome community. So let's cover some basics of the General Assembly. And when I say General Assembly, that's what we call the legislative branch of government in Tennessee. Each General Assembly of the legislature is made up of 2 sessions held over a 2-year period. So for instance, we are currently in the 112th General Assembly, which began on January of this year and will conclude at the end of 2022, at which point there'll be an election that November, and we'll go into the 113th General Assembly in January of 2023. There are 99 members of the House that each serve a 2-year term, and 33 members in the Senate that serve 4-year terms. You need a simple majority to pass any new law, and therefore the magic numbers are always 50 votes in the House and 17 votes in the Senate. The political makeup of the General Assembly is a Republican supermajority. And so what does that supermajority kind of mean? Well, in addition to having the simple majority that you need to pass a law, Republicans hold a 2/3 majority. And that's very key in procedural votes where, you know, for instance, it takes 2/3 vote to cut off debate and put a measure to a final vote. So therefore, if a bill is being debated, Republicans have the ability to end debate and put a bill to a final vote. And I'll talk in a minute about the political climate and how that factors in to the approach policymakers have when it comes to different issues. So a little bit about the schedule of the General Assembly. Tennessee legislators are part-time, meaning that the legislative session typically only meets for part of the year instead of year-round. The framers of the Tennessee Constitution felt that the legislature should be a citizen legislature where elected officials held other positions in their community other than just being an elected official. Therefore, there are a variety of professions among members of the General Assembly: farmers, small business owners, attorneys, doctors, bankers, teachers, those that have been in law enforcement, just an array of different folks that come together. Under the Constitution, the General Assembly is required to convene on the second Tuesday of January of each year. I've already discussed the dynamic of the two sessions of each General Assembly. I will point out that we are in the first year of the 112th, and that's important because typically leadership will remain the same through the following year, meaning that the speakers of each house will stay the same and the committee chairs typically do not change. Also, the members of the standing committees will stay the same. In general, the legislative session starts in January and ends in late April, early May, hopefully, but it does always have the potential to go longer. But the past few years, we've been very fortunate in a sense that it wraps up by May. So some of you may remember the old Schoolhouse Rock segment about the bill on Capitol Hill up there in the right-hand corner. But the General Assembly also uses this other graphic to explain the process to students of how a bill goes from an idea into a law. And so a bill begins with an idea that's taken to a legislator that the legislator comes up with, and he agrees to be the bill sponsor and will have the bill drafted into a bill, have all the idea put into a bill, and then it's officially introduced by being filed in the clerk's office. The speaker will then assign that bill to a committee, and the bill is typically assigned to a committee based on its subject matter. For instance, healthcare related bills are typically going to go to the healthcare committee, or excuse me, to the health committee, whereas a bill about a road or a license plate is going to go to the transportation committee. Sometimes if a bill touches on multiple subjects, it may be heard in multiple committees. The bill sponsor will then request that the bill be heard in a committee meeting, and is at this point that advocates and opponents alike will engage members of the committee to encourage them to vote for or against a bill. During the committee meeting, there may be testimony from anyone who wants to speak in favor of or against a bill. And assuming the bill receives a favorable vote, it goes to the next step in the process. That may be to another committee, or that could be to the floor of the House or Senate for a full vote. A bill has to pass both the House and the Senate in identical forms, and then it will go to the governor for approval or his veto. The key takeaway here is that there's opportunity for your involvement at each of these stages. And so perhaps you have an idea for legislation, or you're really good at kind of grassroots campaigns of, getting people to write letters, emails, phone calls, kind of coordinate those kind of things to express support or opposition to a bill. It could be that you have a powerful personal story that would be really good legislative testimony to share in a committee meeting. Whatever you want to do, there is a role for you in this process. So how is the political climate in Tennessee? Well, Tennessee is a red state. I think everybody is hopefully surely aware of that. And how red are we? Well, Tennessee overwhelmingly voted for Donald Trump in the last presidential elections. The governor is Republican, and I've already kind of discussed the supermajority in the legislature. That's 73 Republicans to 26 Democrats in the House, and 27 Republicans and 6 Democrats in the Senate. And so kind of talked about what that means in terms of some procedural things and how that plays out in the legislature itself, but also try to make the distinction between federal issues and state issues. A lot of what we're talking about today is what the state government has kind of authority or jurisdiction over. But a lot of times there can be these blurred lines and a trickle down effect of things that are going on the national stage and how that kind of comes down to the state level. So for instance, I bring up this example of the sub-minimum wage issue, where businesses are permitted to seek a federal waiver to pay individuals with disabilities below the minimum wage. Sometimes it could be 25 cents an hour or something, somewhat ridiculous. And so there's been a push to end that practice. However, there's also been a debate here recently under the Biden administration in a lot of jurisdictions to raise the regular minimum wage. And so when that issue is very much in the spotlight, any discussions that are about wages or the minimum wage really overshadow this other issue of the sub-minimum wage. And that kind of played out a little bit in the legislature this year. So we can always kind of keep that in mind as we talk about these different issues being handled, whether it is by the federal government or the state government. So why is state level advocacy important? And so even though many disability programs are the result of the federal government, federal legislation in DC, the federal government typically leaves it to the states to actually administer these programs. So of course, at the state level, we have the Department of Intellectual and Development Disabilities, and their programs. At some point, my daughter obviously aged out of early intervention when it was under the Department of Education, but that program is actually under the Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities now. So the early interventions under them. Most laws and procedures for guardian and conservatorships are found in state law. For the Department of Education, of course, the Division of Special Education is responsible for providing information and guidance to school districts and parents regarding the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Department of Education also administers the Individualized Education Account Program, which is a school choice option for those that want their child to attend a participating private school or an independent homeschool. One of the more recent achievements was the enactment of the Katie Beckett waiver, and that's the program for children who are not Medicaid eligible because of their parents' income or assets, and are able to, under this program, potentially be eligible for TennCare benefits. And then lastly, I'll highlight the ABLE accounts that are administered by our state treasurer. This is the savings program that's designed to help Tennessee residents with disabilities put aside money to pay for certain qualified expenses. And this is very similar for a 529 plan that sometimes people use to save money for college, pretty much set up the same way, but is administered through the state treasurer. So as you can see, the state is heavily involved in all these programs, and therefore decisions that impact how these programs are funded, whether they are eliminated or expanded, really rest with state level policymakers. And it's important that you know who they are and how to make your voice heard. So how does DSAMT represent you, and what role does the association play? What role does GiGi's play in advocating for these issues? So DSAMT, I'll speak for them, has always partnered with other organizations to strengthen the voice of the disability community. And a few years back, the association worked on its own piece of legislation that was titled the Down Syndrome Information Act of 2018. You can look in the state law today and find the act at Tennessee Code Annotated 68-1-2601. This law requires the Tennessee Department of Health to provide up-to-date, evidence-based written information about Down syndrome and ensure that that information is accessible to medical providers and those that receive a Down syndrome diagnosis or a positive test result for Down syndrome. So access to this information, as I believe all of us can attest to, is extremely important. I know there's a lot of parents on here today, and I'm sure we all have a story to tell about what information we received when we received that diagnosis, or even when I think about when Charlotte was born in 2009, there was a real lack of information that our doctor had, that we had access to. And so this bill was extremely important in creating a requirement in the law that the Department of Health would have this information out there, work with folks like Vanderbilt Kennedy Center, work with the association, work with other groups to make sure that this information is available, not just to individuals and parents, but also to medical providers, and make sure that they are informed on the latest in medical information and just really help when that happens. For those of you that remember when this was done in 2018, the association and other organizations sent out a lot of emails, blasts, and whatnot, encouraging families to contact their legislators. It was part of the Down Syndrome Day on the Hill, and Alicia, the executive director, she went on the Hill to testify before committees and talk with legislators. And it's this kind of legislative success that we want to continue and have your help in achieving. So a key resource that all of you should be familiar with is the Tennessee General Assembly's website. And there is just a plethora of information on this website. You can find up-to-date information on bills, when a bill is going to be heard. All of the committee meetings and floor sessions are video streamed live, and they are archived. You can go and watch anything from this previous year and go several years back to watch what actually happened in the committee or on a floor session with a particular piece of legislation. This website also has profiles and contact information for legislators. And so a really neat feature that I've highlighted here in the corner on the main page is this Find My Legislator. And if you were to click on that link, you would be prompted for this other smaller window that comes up where you put in your street address, city, and zip code. And this is a very easy, direct way to find out who your state representative is, who is your state senator. So just to go through it, I put in my address in Old Hickory, and the results will show that Bill Beck is my state representative and Heidi Campbell is my state senator. And from these results, you can click on either one of these pictures and it will go straight to the legislator's profile page. On this profile page is their full contact information, phone, mailing address, email, along with some biographical information to learn more about them. You can also see what committees that the legislator serves on, and also see what bills they sponsor or co-sponsor that they're kind of moving through the process. So when we discuss later on about how you can become an effective advocate, this is probably your first step. If you do not already know who your legislators are, you need to go through these steps. Your legislators are going to be your first point of contact for anything related to state government. When there is an issue and you want to make your voice heard, call, email, write a letter, make an appointment, talk with them. If you see them out in the community at an event or whatever, just stay engaged. So I kind of go into this segment now to kind of talk about what happened in this most recent legislative session. And before the official 2021 session began, the governor called a special session. So what's a special session? A special session is just that, it's special. The purpose of special session is for the governor to call in the legislators to address a specific issue outside of what happens during the normal legislative session, so it's more focused. And so in this instance, Governor Lee called a special session to focus on education to address the impact of COVID-19 on our schools. And the special session resulted in 4 major pieces of legislation, which I'll briefly go through. First, the Accountability Hold Harmless Act. This legislation removes any negative consequences associated with evaluation and accountability for this most recent school year. So assessment scores that students take either, I guess, on the TCAP or the Tennessee Ready test, they will only be incorporated in a evaluation or accountability for a teacher or school or a district if they benefit the teacher, school, or district. So student test scores are not going to negatively impact schools or teachers because of the obvious learning loss that's happened, as some students have had to learn virtually, some students have learned in person, there's been the back and forth, all these different things have happened during the pandemic. As I just said, the pandemic caused a lot of school closures and shifts to virtual learning, and so there was a lot of lost classroom time for students. And so the next piece of legislation, this Learning Loss Remediation and Student Acceleration Act, was used to create these additional summer programs that are going on right now, these in-person learning camps and academies for students in grades K through 8. The Literacy Success Act outlines several new requirements for schools to increase reading proficiencies, such as using phonics as a primary way to teach reading in the classroom. Prior to this and still going on, students take a screener test a few times a year to see what additional supports they may need. And so this legislation put into place some additional resources that would be made available to students who need additional supports or at-home activities, all those kind of different things. And then lastly, the General Assembly approved nearly $43 million to use for teacher pay raises. That was effective January 1 of this year. And so I would highlight that anytime that you see that the General Assembly or the governor has proposed a pay raise for teachers, and it's 4%, 3%, whatever the number is, that's what's put out there. But in practice, that is still left up to the individual school districts on how the exact amount that goes to salaries and bonuses or will depend on the school district. So, you know, for instance, in Metro, that might have resulted in an actual increase in salary. In another school district, that may have been a one-time bonus for teachers and staff. And so that's going to look different county by county, school district by school district. I'll talk about kind of the top 5 enactments of the year. And certainly there are other things on the list, but in a lot of the things that I witnessed as being on the front lines, and of course in a lot of what has been recognized by other folks, these are kind of the top 5. There's a lot of other important things happen, but I had to pick 5. These are the 5 I came up with. So excuse me, the only thing that the General Assembly is constitutionally required to do is enact a state budget. They could pass a budget and then pack it up for the year. Now, of course, they don't do that. There's a lot of other important things going on outside of the state budget, but that is a main focus of each legislative session. So this year's state budget was $42.6 billion. The budget includes funding for K through 12 education, capital maintenance and improvements to state properties, which include state parks and roads, funding for TennCare, career and technical education, broadband access, just naming a few things. To give you some perspective on the size of the state budget, the federal government spent $6.55 trillion in 2020. And so obviously there's going to be a huge difference between a state budget and a federal budget. But one of the key differences I always like to highlight, and that you'll often hear legislators or the governor talk about, is that the state does not have the ability to go into debt like the federal government does. You often hear about the federal deficit, this trillions of dollars that the government owes. And you'll be happy to hear that the state of Tennessee is not allowed to do that. We are not allowed to spend beyond our means. And so the General Assembly is constitutionally required to pass a balanced budget. The next kind of top enactment of the year, the General Assembly wanted to create a new court to hear any action challenging the constitutionality of its state law. So if the General Assembly passes a new law and someone thinks they didn't really have the authority to do that, or whatever they did, it's unconstitutional. You often hear that phrase, it's unconstitutional. You have to file a lawsuit, and the court determines if this law is constitutional or not. So in the end, the General Assembly devised a new 3-judge panel with a judge from each grand division that will hear these types of lawsuits. In part, the creation of this new judicial panel stems from some high-profile losses that the state has had in recent years. For instance, last year, the governor's school voucher program was struck down as unconstitutional, and so it's likely that that ruling and some other ones will be appealed to this new 3-judge panel. Governor Lee's signature proposal for this year was criminal justice reform, and that included several components, but there was ones on improving outcomes for formerly incarcerated individuals as it relates to the parole process, better practices that support success post-release from jail. You know, often we don't obviously have sympathy for folks that have been incarcerated, but a lot of times when folks serve their time and you know, pay their debt to society in a sense, they come out of jail, but they have no resources. They have very few job prospects. They may not even have a form of identification or a driver's license. And so over the years, there's been a real effort to try to make that transition back into society easier, and therefore, reduce the recidivism rate, and that the idea that the person just goes right back into prison. And so there's also been expansion of treatment services and community-based supervision as alternatives to jail time. Of course, COVID continues to be a big topic of discussion.
Todd, are you still with us? I think it froze on me, or we lost your sound.
Local governments, say, like the city of Nashville, from requiring businesses to require proof of vaccination for customers, the so-called, vaccine passports. And so those kind of things were touched on during this session. And the last major piece of legislation that I'll talk about is constitutional carry. So Tennessee is now one of 20 states that has permitless carry of a handgun. Anyone 21 or 18 in active duty military can carry a handgun concealed or open without a permit if the individual can lawfully own a gun. So if you don't already have something that prohibits you from owning a handgun, you're free to carry in your waist, in your purse, in the bag, whatever, without having to go through the former process of getting a permit or the training involved with that and those kind of things. So now I'm going to get into legislation that specifically impacted those in the disability community. And before I kind of do that, please note how I've kind of listed the bills. So on this first one, you see HB for House Bill, SB for Senate Bill, and the respective bill numbers. So if you were to go on the General Assembly's website, you can type in HB 1464, and all the bill information would then be available to you. You can get a copy of the bill, you can watch the videos from committee hearings, and you can see how a legislator voted on the bill. A set of names that come after the numbers, those are our bill sponsors from the House and the Senate. These are the legislators that introduce the bills and then shepherd them through the process to become law. So in this instance, Representative Mark Cochran and Senator Mike Bell, that are both of McMinn County, served as the bill sponsors. So this first bill was definitely one of the top bills that DSAMT, GiGis, and a lot of those of us in the disability community helped advocate for. The transplant discrimination prohibition is to make sure that those with disabilities are not discriminated against when it comes to organ transplants. Denying organ transplants to people with disabilities, like those with Down syndrome or autism, is very common in the United States. Some transplant centers may consider the disability as a factor in determining whether a person should be placed on the list or what the priority is on the list. And so this legislation was very important in making sure that that does not happen for patients in Tennessee. This next one, there was a real effort this year to increase the reimbursement rates to agencies that supply direct support professionals. And that was done by trying to raise the wages of these individuals to at least $12 an hour. There is a real issue with the retention and hiring of individuals to work as direct support professionals. And so the hope is that if these agencies are able to pay these folks more, that will help this kind of issue of retaining quality work staff and bringing new people on and keeping them. Excuse me. This next bill modernizes the definition of intellectual disability in the state's criminal code and creates a pathway for individuals on death row to be evaluated under this new definition. So prior to this change, it's unconstitutional to put an individual with an intellectual disability to death. But that defense has to be raised at certain points in the criminal proceedings and in the appeals. And so this new change is retroactive and is likely to impact the case of Purvis Payne, a Memphis man who has intellectual disability, convicted and given the death penalty sentence in a double murder case from 1987. This next bill prohibits judges from making child custody decisions based exclusively on one parent's disability. Despite having the same legal rights as any other parent, a parent with a disability is often discriminated against when it comes to family law issues. Case law has established that you have to prove that a parent is unfit before you terminate custody or visitation rights. But in reality and in practice, parents that have a disability are often treated unfairly. This next bill is attempting to address a very complex issue involving pharmacy benefit managers. And so let me give you kind of the real world example of how this happens. And it may have happened to some of you, but you run into an issue where your doctor has prescribed you a certain medication. Then you get to the pharmacy and the pharmacist informs you that your insurance has actually substituted that prescription for a different medication, some type of alternative medication. Or you might find out that that pharmacy it does not distribute that particular medication that you want. You got to go to a different pharmacy. This is because insurance plans use pharmacy benefit managers to steer you as the patient and consumer to certain drugs and certain pharmacies in order to save the company money. They show preference to certain drug manufacturers or pharmacies, and that's how they kind of create your coverage network. So part of this legislation is to prohibit certain practices by the PBMs to give you as the patient and the consumer more options, or at least more transparency and information when you're trying to get a specific type of medication. The last piece of legislation that became law got a lot of attention. The Teachers Discipline Act requires school districts to implement policies that make it easier for a teacher to remove a disruptive child from the classroom. Many in the disability community express concerns over the potential bias towards students with special needs. If a teacher has this more leeway to remove a student from the classroom, the legislation does lay out a multi-step process where the teacher has to document the actions taken to address the disruptive student's behavior, speaking with the student's parent or guardian, bringing in the school counselor, some other professional to offer assistance, among some other steps. How this legislation impacts students with special needs is likely to take some time to really determine. As school districts, they have to develop and implement these policies. So it's definitely something to be mindful of. Those of us that have school-age children who, have IEPs, certainly it could be a question to bring up in an IEP meeting. What is the district's policy or procedures when it comes to this new law? Is it in effect yet? How does this impact an IEP? These are all kind of questions that we're all kind of learning as we go along. I want to highlight a couple bills that failed to pass, but were obviously very important to the Down syndrome community. I bring these up because these bills can still be considered next year when the General Assembly reconvenes in January. This first one I touched on a little bit earlier when discussing that trickle-down effect of national politics. This bill would have prohibited businesses from paying individuals with disabilities below the minimum wage. It failed for a lack of a second committee, and so what that means is that no member of the committee would second the motion to hear the legislation, and thus the legislation was not debated and deferred until next year. And so I'm only speculating here. This is just my opinion, does not reflect the opinions of anybody else, but I think there's a fair argument that this legislation suffered this fate because of the broader debate that is going on around the country regarding the regular minimum wage and should that be raised. But this is certainly an issue to work on for next year, to work to advocate and educate people on, to make that distinction that this is not any way related to the other discussions going on about the regular minimum wage. This is about folks who are actually getting paid, pennies on the dollar for the same work that anybody else is doing. Another measure that failed to become law was a text to 911 bill that would make texting 911 available statewide to really help people who are not able to actually make a call. And texting to 911 is available in certain parts of the state, but this bill would have made it statewide. There was very widespread support for this bill, but it faced some funding issues. Since some communities would have cost to upgrade their local 911 systems to allow for text messaging. A bill has to be funded, so we have to have a way to pay for it in order for it to become law, and therefore the costs have to be included in the state budget, or in the instance of these local costs, the reflection of that it's kind of like an unfunded mandate that kind of trickles down to local governments if the state is not paying for it. And that cost has got to be reflected somewhere. So the push next year likely to be to ensure that there is funding for this text to 911, and certainly an issue that I think will come up again. So what's in store for 2022? DSAMT worked this year with Representative Sam Whitson of Williamson County, great friend to the association, great friend of GiGi's in the community. Worked with him on a resolution to commit to the use of respectful language. This is similar to the Spread the Word to End the Word campaign. The resolution was introduced kind of late, and so there really wasn't enough time to get it through the process this year. Therefore, DSAMT and other groups will be looking to push the resolution next year. Another important issue that DSAMT has been looking at is related to ABLE accounts and the Medicaid clawback. And for those not familiar with this, if an individual has an ABLE account, that individual is also on Medicaid, when the individual passes away, Medicaid has the ability to claim the remaining ABLE account funds. So any unspent money in that ABLE account fund, Medicaid can come in after the person passes away and say, we need payback for the benefits the person received under Medicaid. And so a growing number of states have enacted legislation prohibiting the state from pursuing this recovery claim against ABLE accounts, this clawback type thing. So potential legislation for next year is going to include making Tennessee one of these states that does not allow the Medicaid, in our instance, the TennCare program, to go after these funds in ABLE accounts. I've already kind of touched on the holdovers from this year, the ending the subminimum wage and the text to 911 legislation. Be on the lookout for updates from the Tennessee Disability Coalition. The coalition hosts an annual Disability on the Hill, and it always has great programs and sessions for you to attend, and just different opportunities to engage legislators. And so, and I'll repeat this several times over the next few slides, but you got to stay connected. Follow DSAMT, follow GiGi's, Tennessee Disability Coalition, any other groups that you're interested in following. Follow their social media stuff, sign up for their emails, and just really stay in the know of what's going on. We've got, all these groups have the same goal, and that is to highlight the needs of individuals with disabilities and to raise them up and make sure that they're treated fair. So now that you've received this kind of wealth of information about the legislature and what's been happening, next you might ask, how do I become an advocate? Go back to step one, find out who your legislators are and connect with them. If you don't know who they are, I've already showed you, go on the General Assembly's website, go to that Find My Legislator link, type in your address, it'll come up for you, no problem. If you already know who your legislators are, that's great. Look for opportunities to connect. So next, with COVID restrictions loosening up, people are getting out and about more, there's more community events happening. Chances are you're going to have an opportunity to run into your legislator at the fair, speaking to a community group, at the ballpark, at the grocery store, wherever you see them. Make small talk. You could use this lunch and learn as your icebreaker. Tell them you recently participated in a lunch and learn and you heard more about the General Assembly, and that's how you found out who your legislator was, or that's how you heard about different bill that passed or something that you liked or didn't like. So, those are kind of things to kind of keep in mind, and show their appreciation if you know that they supported an issue that's important to you. Next, put pen to paper or well, in most sense, I like a good handwritten note. I think that thank you notes and letters, it's been my experience that nothing short of having a face-to-face meeting with a legislator is as impactful as taking the time to write a handwritten note or letter to your legislator. When they get something from a constituent, one of their voters, um, that's just, it's great. And it stands out. Legislators get inundated with hundreds of these mass emails and robocalls and things where you went on a website, you type in your email address, and it sends your email to all 132 members of the General Assembly. That to me is just not an effective way to get their attention because, well, for one thing, legislators really only need to hear from their constituents, the people that live in their legislative districts. A legislator that's from Nashville doesn't really give as much weight to something that they get from somebody in Knoxville because that's not one of their constituents. Whereas if you take the time to handwrite a note or a letter as a voter in their district, that's going to get their attention, and you're more likely to get a response and have an impactful. That kind of method is just, like I said, very impactful. So it's so rare in this day and age for people to take the time to send notes and letters, and therefore, like I said, they stand out. There's something tangible. It's there. It's a piece of paper. It's a card, and it takes effort. It takes effort on our part to take the time to write and mail something, but it also is effort on part of the legislator to read and respond. It's much harder to ignore and dismiss. So write a thank you note to your legislator if they support an issue important to you, or write a letter encouraging them to support an issue that we've kind of talked about for next year. And so, whoa, you want to know more? Maybe you want to know more. I hope you want to know more. We at DSAMT are working on a series for the fall to kind of take what we've done today and give it some more depth. So, we want to take a deeper dive into the process for those of you that are really into civics and want to know more about the legislative process and kind of the ins and outs and all the neat things about it. If you're a political junkie or just really into what's going on in government. We also want to provide more tools to you and how you can become an effective advocate. What do I need to do? What is already out there? What is the association? What are groups have available to me in terms of information, in terms of, what should I put in a letter? What should I put in a note? What should I put on my social media? What should I share with my family and friends? How do I motivate people to contact their legislator? How do I make sure I'm in the know of what's going on? So we want to kind of talk about that too. And then we also want to get more in detail about those issues that are going to be advocated for in next year. And so we want to maybe have a session where we take a deeper dive into Medicaid clawback and the ABLE accounts, or our respectful language resolution, those kind of things that we want to do for next year. So I think I've gotten to the end here. I think we've got time for questions. I've got my contact information here. If you want to email me or send me any comments or questions, I'd love to hear from you. I've also got Aaron Richardson on here, who serves as the Policy and Advocacy Director for DSAMT. Most of you probably have Carter's information as well. Send it out to us. We're happy to chat. And so I'll flip it over to Carter to see if there's any questions that we can take. If you can use the chat feature.
Awesome. Yeah. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat and I'll read them for you. Or if you're on the phone, feel free to unmute yourself too, as we kind of finish up here in the next 10 minutes or so.
Oh, I see a comment from Emily Whitson about the text to 911, about how that could be funded through the taxes that are charged. Yeah, a lot of you probably noticed on your cell phone bill, there's always a 911 fee on there. And so, yeah, it's never a simple answer, but there's always a lot of moving parts when it comes to state government and whatnot. So it does seem like that probably is one that could be easily addressed next year, hopefully.
Perfect. Well, final call. Are there any questions out there for Todd? Awesome. Well, thank you, Todd. Thank you for this just very informative discussion. For any of you who have further questions, again, Todd's email and Aaron's email addresses are here listed on the screen. I will type my email address here in the chat box. And this has been recorded, so if you want to come back and look at this in a later time, we will send out a link to the recording here afterwards. But otherwise, have a great week, and thank you again to Todd.
This is Erin Richardson. I just wanted to say thank you, Todd. Really appreciate your expertise and sharing all of that with us. And yeah, hopefully this was helpful to folks. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks. Have a great week.